Mediopolis, Chapter 7. Strange Study Shows. So your mum said you're in the midst of a dissertation, stated the older visitor. What's it all about then? Asked the older man. Sat there at the dining table, with all the other children surrounding them, and with the older visiting son also there, visiting from the student campus, and the mother also there listening in too. What's it all about? Asked the older man finally, turning into questioner, and turning to face the young visiting student's son. The older man asked, inquiring after the student, and asking whether it was too much for him, working out, and whether the work was enough. He didn't want to ask him about all the party shows and embarrass him. No, he wanted to ask about current study shows that he was looking into. He asked what the current studies were, and what the current shows that he was studying were. Concerning media studies, theology, sociology, he was preparing for a new showing about various religions and philosophical sects. There were a wide spectrum of different groups that he was studying and how they interacted within each other. And the world, it was a complex study. It was proving to be hard presenting a cohesive show, one that didn't oversimplify it too much. There were people that he had believed long ago in a film. They had believed the film was directed by God. It was thought to be a divinely inspired film. It became a series of the divinity films, so it was claimed. That many had actually followed the series of films. They were known as the people of the film, even though there was a dispute over whether the divinity-inspired film was the actual original and not an edited version of the original God film, as others called it, or God show, as some others called it. Some parts of the alleged original film cut out. One sect allegedly believed the earlier films claimed to be the God show or the original good show, whilst others believed the show was actually edited at some point, and that the divine film that was divinely inspired and divinely inspired the director, the actors and editors was only one of a series of films though. Many felt the films were so different it couldn't be the same director that was behind them all, although there was also another rival sect, and they believed both the divine film and the alleged earlier series of other divine films, and a fourth sect, they believed that all of those films were part of a series of divinely inspired films. A later fourth sect actually believed both the films were faulty though, earlier films and the later films, and that all of the holy films were corrupted. Not only that, but the people of the film had also provoked an appearance of a heretical movement, what was called the questioning divine film. Then there was later the anti-God show, expose God show, questioning God show. There were many other shows that were then born as a result, as a reaction to that earlier show. To a lot of people, that film and the later shows were of importance, and they were of real importance because so much of it resonated with so many people, but also because of its popularity. However limited it was, the film and the many sequels that it generated, and sometimes the prequels too, and their multiple versions of it, it was reasonably successful to some people, yet of course had its many critics. Yet there were a lot of other films, and many people had just never seen the film before. So, however much it was considered a divine film, or a divinely inspired series of films, or in a divinely inspired film, it still hadn't been witnessed or seen or watched by so many people. Some people had never heard of it, never knew of it. Even when perhaps a few had, they still weren't that familiar with it. They didn't know it that well. They knew of the divine films, the divine film series, and the different versions of them. And they knew about the debates, but they hadn't really watched, studied, and researched them themselves, not that well. So there were so many of those divine claimed films that were long and complex and were quite demanding of the person watching it, demanding in terms of the time, energy, and the focus that was required to really absorb and understand what the actual film seemed to be about. Because it was so long and had a sequence of so many different versions that were put together, and then there was so much complexity within it. So people watched short segments of it and then returned dozens of times to re-watch it or re-hear the words yet again and re-watch it multiple versions to study it time and time again. It was very hard to fully understand the meanings of the epic sagas. The actual entirety of the Divinity films, the official version at least, lasted 72 hours in its entirety. But many people spent thousands, hundreds or thousands of hours studying it, nevertheless. That was said to be a series of films, yet others had longer or shorter series that were inspired as a result of it. The younger student explained all this, that these were the focus of his studies that he was looking into, that what effect those divinity inspired films or divinely inspired films, what effect they had on the general population. Did other people still believe that there were divinely inspired films? And did it make a big difference to other people, whether they were or not? Those things that he was looking into, where sociology, theology, and also media studies overlapped. He was interested in how the different divinely inspired films, how they affected and how they affected different demographic groups and how they were used, of course, by different groups as well. Those were the focus of the students' studies, explained the young visitor. He explained it to the older visitor, the elderly visitor, who was his questioner, as the mother and the other children were also listening in, each wondering if the elderly man would go on to question more. Instead, he said it sounded an interesting field of study, something he didn't know that much about, was familiar of course. He'd heard of the Divinity series of films, the multiple versions of them, and all the debates about them. Of course, he was familiar of those, he just didn't know that much about it. He hadn't watched and studied them at length, especially. Still, it was something he was vaguely interested of, and he knew about at least. He was only asking out of curiosity, really, just to know the actual brief of what the study was. The student said it was to try and understand those religious films, the holy films, as some people called them, to find their social context, how they emerged, how they had changed over the decades, how different people used those religious shows, their religious films, and how and why they used them too. That was the focus of his study, in short. And really, he wanted to study how people's faith in film can be both a positive but also a negative thing, both for the individual and society too. That's what the student claimed. The elderly man had laughed a little, not trying to be unkind. That sounds more like a conclusion than a question, though, stated the older man. I was studying them a long time ago, but there's been a lot of positive and negative reactions to those films, said the student, defensively though. The elderly man said, more softly now, that it would be more interesting to see and to hear about all the other religious films and the people of the film, because nobody he knows ever watches those films anymore. They're too busy acting in their own films or watching other films or being in one themselves. He went on to say he did miss the old days when people actually watched the great religious films instead of just trying to be in them themselves. The days when people studied films in depth and at length, saying that whenever everyone is talking all at once, no one hears anyone. Everyone has their own separate film today, the older man bemoaned. So no wonder people look for unifying film to connect them. And the older man went on to say, no wonder some people saw something divinely inspired, however imperfect and misled and mistaken it was. its moving visuals, and its songs, and its trialogues also, that were translated and dubbed into multiple languages and subtitled too, that so many people from so many backgrounds could understand and relate to. No wonder it was so moving to so many people, and a lot of people that were moved and related to it. Well, was there any great wonder in it all, really, though? Asked the older man, and he was unsure about it. The student had said he would take his time to look into it more, and he couldn't really go into the full depth of the study, not now with the rest of the family, and would go into it more in deeper detail later with him. For the discussion, he said the student had said he wanted to use one of the old man's quotes, if that was okay, in the video. Well, they would cut and paste some of the video quotes that various others used and said to add it into the video dissertation to be submitted at the end in a few months. And the old man said, of course, but felt that he was just trying to flatter him, perhaps, and hadn't said anything that interested, really. Nevertheless, he was interested to hear about the student's studies, and said that he would be interested to hear more and deeper about it later, to have a more in-depth discussion, that he still had lots more time for people and still wanted to hear much more about such studies. The student said he had lots more people still to interview about it and was still part way through the dissertation yet, so couldn't really discuss where or when any conclusion might emerge, although he was concerned about not upsetting the people of the film, people that believed the film had some divine inspiration, people that held it close to their hearts, that believed it was authentic, genuine, sensational to them, authentic to them in some way. He wanted it to be sensitive to them, but also he wanted to be honest about how that film had affected many other people also. He wanted to be honest about it, as well as sensitive to other people's reactions to the dissertation. That's what he claimed, anyway, to the older man and the family, to his younger children, his younger siblings, and to the mother present too, who nodded along happily, glad to hear of his good intentions at least. He did want to try and give an honest and relevant portrayal of the religious films that had occurred, or at least that's what he claimed. The studying son's friend also was there visiting, who introduced himself as Cybercat. He visited that evening to the family show, telling the mother, who had only watched and heard him before a few times, that it was his virtual name, of course, the show name, and not his mother's, that he only used an earlier name on the mother show, and he didn't do family shows with the rest of his family. Parents often chose children's names for their family shows, whilst people chose their own names for their own shows. Sometimes the mother would decide, or the parents together. Sometimes even the father would, depending on the family. Or when they're older, or young adult, they, as an adolescent person, could choose themselves. Often an additional virtual name or just the amended older name that could be adapted, the chosen parental name that could be adapted for a new show or a new family or a new friendship group perhaps, and one for the public shows also that could be adapted, old names adapted for new shows, or new names chosen for new shows, although there were those that had only one name for all their different shows, but with just different adaptations of that name. Still, she knew Cybercat as his name while he was visiting their show, because I guess it was his friend's family show. The son's friend had snacked on the dinner leftovers, chatting casually with the son also, and with the sister, whilst the mother and the elderly father figure listened to some of the children's latest songs, and they watched them also performing some of the dance routines. They had all laughed along at some of them falling down onto the sofa in some sort of dance, theatrically jumping onto the giant's cushions. even if that wasn't really part of the routine. And a few of the children were annoyed that the younger ones were a step behind in the choreographed movements, or missing whole sequences of the moves, apparently, they claimed, despite the mother and the strange visiting father both saying that it was a wonderful dance, very funny and thoughtful, very interesting, he'd said. They insisted on showing many of the recordings of their rehearsals, of their dance shows, when they were all in sync together. They wanted to show a recording of it when they were all in perfect sync or near perfect sync, when they all seemed to match each other's movements much more. A much better performance, without without having a stranger in the room or someone else overlooking them to worry about. Certainly the choreography and the singing was more in sync and a better quality, hitting the notes at the right time in the right way. Yes, it was more succinct, special on the film, yet it was very similar to what he'd already just witnessed in person also. So it didn't seem to make sense to go through it all again, annoyingly to the elderly man, because it was such a long dance that it had been, with so many steps and dance movements and turns, that he'd only just watched it, just to be nice, but it just went on so long. And as it took a lot of energy and focus for him to concentrate on all the words, to understand the meaning of the dance song, it took so much energy. The elderly visitor found himself phasing in and out of the film a little bit because he was getting so tired now from the visit, all the talk at the dinner, then watching all the dances, trying to absorb what they were really about, then watching the children's reactions, seeing them happy, that the mother was impressed at least, and the elderly man was forced himself to watch it all to the end. Thankfully, when it finally climaxed, eager to get to the mother alone, to get back to his issues and discussing them with her alone. He was glad, finally, to get to the end of the children's performances and songs. He'd come round to visit the mother to have a talk with her, more seriously, as well as also just to meet the family casually with her, and just to have a little chat with them. He'd come round especially to discuss with her in person, though, some of his more private issues. Perhaps it would be a longer wait to get her properly alone, although the children had to sleep at some point, surely, later on, perhaps. One of the children suggested showing one of the older, funnier dance films that the mother had seen countless times before, but said, sure, Mr. Porter might want to see it. He'd love to see it, probably, she suggested. And after a moment's pause, suppressing a yawn, he'd said he'd love to see it again. Listen, watch it with them, of course. Noticing his weary face, the mother suppressed a smile, though. It would do him good to have him listen to watch other people's lives. How often did he leave on other old man shows during her visits to him? How often was she forced to watch older man shows during his many visits? Even when he would fall asleep on the sofa during the visits, while she was cleaning his apartment or preparing food, drink, or medications. He had his elder man voices talking out in the room at her. Or she was surrounded by his projected images, flashing and swirling around the room, talking at her sometimes, as if she was him, although she kept quiet, didn't attempt to wake him during those, unsure if he was really just sitting there resting, perhaps as a statuing, very still, listening to the voices, hearing them. Of course, it wasn't a major issue. She'd had her headphones on and could turn off the voices he played during her visits if she wanted to. If the lectures went on too long, or got too loud, or weren't that interesting to her anyway, she could turn them down or off. It was okay. Maybe they put the old man to sleep, she wondered. She wondered, although there was interesting parts she occasionally found interesting herself, feeling some of it was a little patronizing to her, though. And without a patron to argue with, the elderly man, when he was with it, alert, focused, and attentive with her, well, he could be different. He could listen, watch the shows with her, and sometimes with comment on the shows while she was there with her, or in a different part of the room, occupied in a job, partly, but still able to listen in and still respond. As if she was part of the show, joining in with him. And he would even invite her to question other elderly men on the elderly men's shows. Or he would question one of them, but to her, as if she knew the resolution to the struggles of the elderly, or of older men even. She would often guess at answers, only to provoke some lecture within him, or further questioning of the older men. So she would sometimes just shrug or say, I don't know, who knows? Stating she didn't know, or didn't really want to get drawn into it, or want to lose focus on the cleaning, the work she was doing, the medication preparing. And he would say, what did it matter if she took a short break and returned to it later? Couldn't she have a conversation and work? After all, she'd been doing it so long now. Shouldn't she be on auto clean or something? And other visitors had sung and debated, and even sung poems while they were cleaning, and only after a few weeks of learning the routines. The mother visitor had said that was them and she was different, and she was sorry if she wasn't that much of a debater and didn't want to join in. But that wasn't what she'd been hired for, no. She had even attempted to recall a few poems for him, yes, and she did a few careless dances for fun. She recalled many poems for him too, even though he hadn't asked her to, really. But she wasn't there to join in any of those debates, she told him. Yet he had claimed there was no story in any of her poems, couldn't understand them, he said. He couldn't understand any of it. And the mother had said she was sorry he felt that way, that maybe she didn't know the story of life that she was trying to tell, or understand everything she was about, and was still trying to make sense of it all herself. Feeling a little judgmental in his criticism, the elderly man had said, there were many beginnings and endings of stories, yet he couldn't see how they all had related in her poems, and he admitted maybe he just didn't know her or her poems well enough yet to understand or judge them, and he said sorry. He felt it was like a rambled, drunken story at times, at a pub or something, where she seemed to go off on wild tangents, multiple tangents too. But he didn't want to say that at the time, unsure if that would be a compliment or perhaps even an insult to her, because he was still learning her poetizing or what she was about, why she talked in that way, just as she was still learning about his lecturing or his rationalizations, as she sometimes called them. At least you don't have to dance, said the mother to the elderly man, leaving him with the children momentarily, as he was watching another dance performance, leaving him happily watching with them, to go off and visit the kitchen, and see what the eldest son and her daughter, and the visiting friend, Cyber Cat, to see what they were up to, as well as to bring them all drinks as well. For the three teenagers, the adolescents, were there, having a private chat show together, until the mother had entered, when she began asking them if they could listen to the children for a while later, so that she and the older visitor could then have a private chat show together, just to themselves. And grudgingly the teenagers agreed, seeing as though they would only be a few hours, watching the childish dance shows together, and the sports show